When college freshman Catherine Foster goes missing, students at University of South Alabama fear a boogeyman's on campus.
How could somebody just evaporate from a campus with thousands of others around her?
Was she being held against her will?
Let me out of here, please!
Being raped?
Why are you doing this?
Had she been killed?
And when their worst nightmare comes true,
This is not supposed to happen on our college campus.
it triggers one of the longest manhunts in Mobile history.
That case still haunts detectives within Mobile Police Department.
That's terror, real terror.
Located deep in the South, right on the Gulf Coast, is the port city of Mobile, Alabama.
Mobile is a very dynamic city. It's full of tradition, full of history. Contrary to a lot of beliefs, Mobile is the mother of Mardi Gras.
And these gracious old homes that are antebellum.
It's a small city with a big heart, and bursting at the seams with Southern hospitality.
A city with a lot of culture, a lot of soul.
Nestling safely in the heart of Mobile is the University of South Alabama, South as it's called by the student body.
It's very much kind of a bubble. You've got pathways. It's very much the kind of campus where you see kids walking, you see them riding bikes. It's a relaxed place where people talk, they stop, spend time together. It has that really warm feel where people know each other.
I was manager of security. My two children attended school there. I would consider it to be relatively safe compared to other campuses.
South's warm, vibrant campus is just the place for 18-year-old Catherine Foster. And when she enrolls in 1979, the smart young freshman shines brightly among the campus community.
I would say that Catherine certainly could be considered the all-American girl.
She was always described as a kind, wonderful girl that everyone absolutely loved.
I'm moving in today too, so
She was salutatorian of her class. She was from a big Catholic family. A very kind of sweet Southern girl.
This ambitious, caring girl is also very proud of her roots, choosing South for its close proximity to family and friends.
Catherine's hometown was in Pascagoula, Mississippi, just right over the state line. It's not that far from Mobile.
She was able to travel back and forth to visit.
Best of all, her high school sweetheart, Jake Donovan, is a star soccer player at the university.
He also seemed to have everything going for him. He's on a soccer scholarship.
Everybody that knew Catherine and Jake understood it was just a young budding love. It was the two kids that were in love that saw an entire future together.
And college life keeps getting better when Catherine's best friend from home, Susie Shanahan, joins her in the freshman class.
Really? Oh my God, I moved in, but whoa.
Susie had been her friend forever and ever, since elementary school. They had been tight. Just kind of made sense they'd go to college together, too.
Stop waiting.
On day one, Susie and Catherine meet Jamie Kellum. The three discover they have more than just the university in common.
You're from Pascagoula, aren't you?
Catherine and Susie actually met Jamie while standing in line at registration, and in that conversation learned they were all from Pascagoula. And so naturally, they did start to hang out together.
Okay.
They were going shopping. Mobile had a new mall. About that time, it was a big deal. You had Mardi Gras. I'm sure going to watch Jake. I'm sure they were at those games. They just became the Three Musketeers, did everything together.
The three girls seem to have it all, with nothing but a bright and prosperous future ahead. On Thursday afternoon, February 21st, 1980, the friends plan one of their regular outings to go shopping together in downtown Mobile.
The plan was to meet in the parking lot near Jamie's car.
And then they were going to go to the grocery store as soon as Susie got out of class.
Hey, Jamie.
But when Susie arrives, Jamie is all alone.
Where's Catherine?
So, she said she forgot something, but I think we both know where she is.
Jake.
Well, I've been waiting for 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
The two girls decide to leave without her.
Let's just go.
After all, the two lovebirds, Catherine and Jake, are always running off together. Later that day, Catherine is a no-show for her 2 p.m. class with Susie. It's not like her to skip a class.
Anybody seen Catherine?
If anyone knows where she is, it's Jake.
Jake, where's Catherine?
Some of her friends found him in the library, hoping to find her with him,
She didn't show up for class?
only to discover that he hadn't seen her and was not even aware that she was missing.
Who's she been hanging out with?
When Jake storms off, Susie wonders if the two are still fighting about something that happened a few days earlier.
It was learned that Jake and Catherine had had a disagreement over an event that had occurred at Mardi Gras. Apparently, Jake had been caught kissing another female, and this had caused an argument between the two.
Why would you do this to me?
What do you mean? It was just a kiss.
You just embarrassed me in front of everyone. I can't do this right now. I'm done.
Catherine, come on.
By 6 p.m. that night, Catherine is still missing. Her friends' concern for her is now sky high,
Jake will find her, okay?
and Susie feels compelled to notify Catherine's family.
Susie, being the longtime friend, picks up the phone and makes that phone call to Catherine's mother.
This was so out of character for Catherine to go missing without telling anybody where she is.
Catherine disappeared and I don't know where she's at.
It immediately set off alarm bells with the family, who immediately got in a car and drove to the university.
Campus security is already on top of the situation.
We obtained a photograph of Catherine that showed all the campus officers and instructed them to be on the lookout.
Once they reach Mobile, the Fosters try to file a police report. But there's a problem.
Because Catherine was 18 years old and considered an adult, they could not report her missing for 24 hours.
There could have been some students, I imagine, that might not have been that alarming for them to kind of disappear, but not Catherine.
I met with her mother and her roommates and close friends, and I was convinced that a disappearance of that nature and not checking in was out of character.
As every hour went on, especially a whole nother day, their fears had to grow worse.
By Friday, February 22nd, 24 hours later, the Fosters file a missing persons report. Police officially join the search.
A young college co-ed disappears from the University of South Alabama campus. Anyone with information about Catherine Foster's disappearance is urged to contact police as soon as possible.
The alarming news of the co-ed's disappearance rattles the university.
It became frantic around campus. There was a missing 18-year-old female student that doesn't run off. For her to just all of a sudden vanish without anyone seeing her, it caused alarm throughout the entire campus.
Their minds really go toward just boogeyman out of the darkness, something that unknown, but that's terror.
As Mobile police begin the search, the student body also takes action, with Catherine's closest friends leading the way.
We're looking for our friend Catherine. Have you seen her? Okay, you know her because she's just super popular.
Jamie, Susie, and several other students, they've created flyers. They're putting them all over the campus. Other students are joining. They're going from building to building again, just looking for Catherine.
As they try to stay positive, her parents struggle for answers.
Your mind would just have to go everywhere. You have nothing to lead you in any direction. That had to be most frightening of all because it leaves all options on the table. They had to have been terrified.
Do not touch anything.
By Saturday morning, nearly 2 days since her disappearance,
Guys, let's go.
a student search party bands together to continue looking.
Catherine!
Catherine's friends and family won't rest until they find her. But no one's prepared for what they're about to see. In February 1980, the disappearance of popular freshman Catherine Foster has the University of South Alabama's student body frantically searching. She's been missing for nearly 48 hours when someone among the scores of students combing the campus spots something in the woods.
Surprisingly not far from where her dorm was, some students find what they think is a student just taking a nap.
I was fairly close by, and I was close enough to go on foot. And I did run. I confirmed, the worst fear. That was Catherine's body.
In an instant, the air of dread that has been looming overhead turns to full-on horror.
Nothing like this had ever happened to the university that drove this type of fear throughout the campus. With the discovery of Catherine's body, that sense of security from the students' perspective of safety was shattered.
One of the first investigators to arrive on scene is Wilbur Williams, a sergeant with the City of Mobile Police Department.
I was a young officer eager to do my job, and I was an alum of South Alabama, so it hit home there.
The stunned students watch as their campus becomes a brutal crime scene. As they begin examining the scene, a strange picture takes shape.
There was absolutely no signs of a struggle near or around Catherine's body. There was no drag marks to indicate that somebody had killed her somewhere else. There was absolutely no sign of any type of sexual assault. There was no indication there had been any altercation whatsoever.
Stranger still is the condition of Catherine's body.
Her clothes were neatly positioned on her body. It appeared that she was recently made up. She just did not look like she had been lying out in the woods for several days.
The cause of death raises questions too. Catherine's been shot twice at close range.
The medical examiner was able to determine that Catherine had suffered a gunshot wound in the back of her head.
The second gunshot wound was a near contact wound to the right temple to make sure she was dead.
Judging from the evidence, it appears Catherine went willingly.
Her body did not exhibit any signs of constraint. She had not been handcuffed. There was no indications of ligatures. There were no indication of restrictions to her body. The commonality of thought was that she knew her assailant, or possibly she had left with some type of authority figure, someone that she trusted.
Due to the pristine condition of her body, the medical examiner sets the time of death at 8 to 24 hours before Catherine's body is discovered. But she's been missing nearly 48 hours.
That still left us with a 24-hour block of time that we could not explain. And that was the biggest issue. Where was Catherine kept during that period of time?
Did someone abduct her, take her away, kill her, and bring her back and stage her?
Overcome with sorrow, Catherine's parents return home to Pascagoula.
I don't know that there are words that can describe the kind of grief parents would feel when they think their child's off safely to college, and then to hear the word first that she's missing, and then to fear the worst, and then have that confirmed for you that your child is now deceased.
Catherine's body is finally found in a wooded area near the Molecular Science Building. She's been shot twice in the head.
Meanwhile, the news of Catherine's murder haunts the campus.
The investigation is still preliminary. Anyone with information is urged to contact police.
The student body was in a state of panic. There was fear that spread throughout that campus, especially with the young women that lived on the campus. Many people left the campus because of their fear.
As students try to come to grips with the tragedy, police get to work. Detectives question Susie Shanahan and Jamie Kellum, the two friends who were supposed to meet Catherine the morning she disappeared.
friends with Catherine?
Susie was very emotional. Her best friend on this earth had been killed, was dead, wasn't coming back.
Susie tells police that she was supposed to meet her friend after class, but Catherine never showed up.
Walk me through that Thursday.
Jamie explains that as she and Catherine were walking out together,
Oh my gosh, I totally just forgot my purse inside. Okay, I'll meet you at the car.
Catherine went back at the last moment.
Their idea is, well, she just changed her mind to go spend time with Jake. They're very, very emotional. They're sobbing and crying.
Both girls have solid alibis for their whereabouts during the 2 days Catherine was missing. They were either together or with others looking for Catherine.
It was very frustrating to try to work through the friends and to determine if there was any indication that any of them could possibly be involved in it.
The girls recommend investigators check in with Jake, Catherine's sweetheart. It's a strong bet he'll know something. But before detectives can get to him, they get their first big lead. A student comes forward believing she may have witnessed Catherine's murder. It's been 24 hours since University of South Alabama freshman Catherine Foster was found dead on campus. As a shocked student body tries to come to terms with the horrifying news, Mobile police are out desperately searching for clues.
They have far more questions than they have answers. So anybody and everybody is included in the investigation at this point.
2160.
One particular lead has investigators eager to speak with a student who believes she can help.
There was a female student on the campus that lived in one of the dorms that suffered from a severe asthma condition. Saturday morning at approximately 2:30ish, she suffered an attack.
She ran to the window to get some fresh air. She heard a couple of pops.
She hears a couple of firecrackers or two noises. She didn't think a whole lot about it at the time, and she went back to bed. Later, upon learning that Catherine had been killed on campus, she then came forward and provided that information.
Like, bang, bang.
She wonders, were those gunshots, was that connected?
It's possible the student could be mistaken.
What's going on?
But two campus security guards later report the gunshots too.
Did you hear that?
At first, they thought it was students setting off fireworks for Mardi Gras. Once learning of Catherine's murder, they too reconsider.
This information was important because, first of all, it established two sounds that corresponded to the number of gunshots that we knew Catherine had suffered. We also knew the time fit into the timeline that the medical examiner had established, 8 to 24 hours.
2:30 in the morning would mean 8 to 9 hours before Catherine's body was discovered.
It becomes very plausible that the time of death was about 2:30 a.m. Saturday, and that time stamps the investigation from then on.
Hey, Jake, you got a second?
Armed with this new information, investigators zero in on the person closest to Catherine, boyfriend Jake Donovan.
Question for you. Catherine, it was just a kiss.
They want to confirm Jake's alibi for early Saturday morning,
Catherine, come on.
especially in light of the couple's recent argument.
You know, you look as close as you can. And him being the boyfriend, the events that had happened at Mardi Gras, yeah, that was probably leaning a little toward Jake.
I found out you and Catherine
Jake appears cooperative and willingly offers details of his whereabouts on Thursday and Friday.
Jake was able to provide us with information of classes that he attended, people that he had talked to, places where he was.
But when asked where he was when the alleged gunshots were heard,
Jake was unable to provide us with a rock-solid alibi for 2:30 Saturday morning, other than he was in his room asleep, getting ready to get up the next morning and participate in the search party for Catherine on campus.
to prove he's telling the truth, Jake agrees to take a polygraph test.
Jake failed the polygraph test miserably.
But with nothing more concrete to go on, Jake is allowed to go free. And in his gut, Sergeant Williams doesn't believe he did it.
Jake was an emotional wreck. I think because of his emotional attachment to Catherine, those results of the test were affected. I truly believe that he was honest, that he was in love with Catherine. We did follow up, but as everything started to unfold, the possibility of him being involved started to diminish each and every day.
Convinced that Jake, Susie, and Jamie were not involved in the murder, Mobile police start looking beyond Catherine's inner circle. Two days after her body is found, the funeral mass for Catherine is held at her hometown church in Pascagoula, Mississippi.
It was a huge event because so many people knew Catherine. Her reputation in the community and her church was exceptional. It was a very emotional service.
Catherine's closest friends travel from campus to grieve their beloved friend.
Here are these three friends sitting there. You've got Jake, Susie, and Jamie. It had to have been just very overwhelming, their feelings, because they were the last to see her alive.
Try as they might, no one can fathom what Catherine's parents are thinking.
The end of the world would be the death of a child. Just don't know how you would get over that.
That child will forever be 18 years old in their mind. And then they have lost her.
Back on campus, fear turns to frustration.
And because there was no arrest by the police, that person, in the minds of the students there, was still walking among them at the campus.
Even for police, the murder is especially troubling. Finding Catherine's killer takes on renewed urgency. Sergeant Williams can't help but take her case personally.
It was an offense to me because I attended South Alabama. I took that as a personal insult, so there was a tremendous amount of pressure from every direction.
Over the next few weeks, investigators fan out, following up on every lead.
Investigators have talked to hundreds of people. They've cast a wide net.
As they began to look into the backgrounds of different people on the campus, they began to focus on a maintenance worker.
That would have given him access to the entire campus. The maintenance worker could have been assumed as a person of authority if he had approached Catherine.
It's just the break detectives have been waiting for.
We were excited because we felt after the number of weeks that we'd been working on it, he was certainly one of the brighter suspects, if you will, person of interest.
And as it turns out, the maintenance worker has a criminal record, which includes attempted assault. And there's more.
Not only was his victim a South Alabama student, but she looked strangely a lot like Catherine.
After several weeks of nothing but obstacles in the search to find Catherine Foster's killer, police believe they've found their man. They've discovered that a university maintenance worker, Ronnie Willis, has a criminal past involving another female student at the University of South Alabama.
The case he was involved in was an attempted rape and assault with a deadly weapon.
Several months prior, Willis offered a ride to a South co-ed.
Hey, you want a ride?
Yeah.
Get in.
The young lady that he had picked up and had given a ride did in fact resemble Catherine Foster.
He abducted and attempted a sexual assault. That student resisted and broke away and ran, and he shot that particular student in the leg.
The story seems too good to be true. Willis has the perfect profile for Catherine's killer, but as it turns out, he also has the perfect alibi.
He was able to alibi through time cards and witnesses that he was in a different area of the university at the time that Catherine Foster would have went missing.
It's a big letdown, and Ronnie is cleared of all charges.
The roller coaster ride of any investigation is the ups and the downs. It was one of those high moments, and of course it didn't take long for it to evaporate.
With no new information coming in, the case stalls. Years go by, but detectives refuse to slow down their efforts.
This file remained in our office, and there was very seldom a week or 3 or 4 days that went by that we didn't discuss it.
Then, on February 22nd, 1983, almost 3 years to the day that Catherine's body was found, investigators get a flash of hope.
We received a call of a possible suicide. When we arrived on the scene, we determined that the victim of the suicide was in fact a former security guard at the University of South Alabama. He had succumbed to an overdose of sleeping pills.
Turns out it's not just any security guard either. It's Louis Shea, one of the security guards who heard the mysterious gunshots the night of Catherine's murder. And what police find in Louis's home sets off alarm bells.
A lot of people described it as a shrine for Catherine Foster.
One of the first items that caught my attention was a copy of the autopsy. He had gone through and had made notations in the margins and had marked things that were very particular. The time of death, the 2 gunshots to the head. He had written poems. He had written several letters to the editors of the campus newspaper.
Investigators are stunned, but nothing compares to what they uncover next.
In the area above the garage, there was a makeshift cage out of chicken wire that was made to be able to lock it. It was large enough to actually contain a person.
Inside that enclosure was a mattress. There was some sheets. There was a pillow. Immediately, the old ticker speeds up, and we believe we have found where Catherine Foster spent her last few days of life.
At that moment, everyone in the room begins to wonder, could Louis Shea have killed Catherine?
Someone help, please.
If you go back to the theory that Catherine had been abducted and then kept without ligatures, which meant that she would have been kept in a room of some sort, then this really fit.
He was an authority figure. She would have been comfortable leaving with him. He would have been able to walk up to Catherine and says, "Come with me, we've got to go."
But after years on the case, Sergeant Williams is not so quick to assume. When he does some more digging, he discovers a big problem with their Louis Shea theory. It's impossible for the ex-security guard to have been in 2 places at the same time.
He was with a fellow officer at the exact time that we thought the death shots were fired.
There's also a problem with the time frame. The medical examiner claims Catherine may have been missing more than 24 hours before her murder. There are other holes in the theory, too.
If somebody had access to this young woman for 24 to 36 hours, why was she never sexually assaulted? Louis Shea was not the killer, even though I think on the surface he made a very good one.
The one fact police can't shake from their minds is the ghoulish scene above the garage. What on earth was Louis doing with that cage?
All right, Dad, lay down.
The cage in the garage was actually constructed to restrain his grandfather, who suffered from dementia. They literally locked Grandpa in the cage to keep him from roaming the neighborhood.
On campus, in the minds of the new student body, Catherine's murder begins to fade from reality into urban legend.
You had generations of students come and go. So those that would have been there and remembered the panic and the sadness of her death, they were gone.
More than a decade passes, and the cold case slips into a deep freeze. Still, investigators never give up, hoping someday they'll have a thaw in the investigation.
We'd lived this case for so long that every day we expected something to happen. New investigators came in. There was continuous follow-up on it, but nothing new surfaced during that period of time.
Until 22 years after Catherine's murder. Mike Morgan is the sergeant in charge of the Mobile Police Department's homicide unit. The Foster case became legend before he ever joined the force.
I first heard about Catherine Foster's case while I was a student at the University of South Alabama. It was a huge case file for an unsolved case.
On the morning of December 4th, 2002, Morgan receives a phone call that revives the case.
Hi, this is Mike Morgan.
And thrusts him into the spotlight.
I knew that I needed to go and speak to this gentleman very, very quickly.
If what he says is true, the man on the phone could hold the key to the crime.
We were going to be able to solve a very old murder case.
It's December 4th, 2002, and Mobile PD Sergeant Mike Morgan has just received a phone call that has blown open the 22-year-old murder investigation of Catherine Foster. He's on his way to Pascagoula, Mississippi, Catherine's hometown, to meet with a mysterious informant named Bobby Wicker.
When I first met with Bobby Wicker, he explained to me that he was in a local AA group there in Pascagoula, and he had information about an unsolved murder in Mobile that occurred on the campus of South Alabama in 1980.
A woman in the group came to Bobby with a deep secret.
One night during one of their meetings, she then confided in him that she had killed Catherine while attending the University of South Alabama in Mobile years earlier.
To help ease her conscience, Bobby suggested she follow one of the key steps of the AA program.
Part of the 12-step process is to right a wrong that you've done to somebody. Came up with this idea of writing down the apology and reading it at the cemetery over the grave of Catherine Foster.
Come to you. The girl who took your life. I don't know where to begin.
Bobby tells Morgan how the girl lured Catherine into the woods, asking for help to find plants for a botany class. She made sure Catherine led the way, while plotting her next move.
She removed a .22 caliber handgun that she had stolen from her grandmother, and she shot Catherine right in the back of the head.
Bobby divulges the girl's name, Jamie Letson. Morgan knows there's no one named Letson in Catherine's case file. Could Jamie Letson be Jamie Kellum, Catherine's good friend from college? Bobby then drops another bombshell, telling Morgan that Jamie killed Catherine the day she went missing. And after making sure she was dead, Jamie disposed of the gun in a dumpster before rushing to the parking lot to meet Susie Shanahan.
Jamie gets to the car and meets Susie and says, oh, changing plans. Catherine just wanted to go hang out with Jake.
It all seems too fantastic for Sergeant Morgan to believe. Reluctant to buy Bobby's story, he reviews the case files and runs a background check on Jamie.
As it turns out, Jamie had been married and divorced, and her husband's last name was Letson. We discovered that she had been arrested multiple times years earlier, mainly for theft.
If Bobby's account is true, it shakes up the original timeline. Records show that Jamie had an airtight alibi for the estimated time of the murder, when the alleged gunshots were heard. On early Saturday morning, she was spending the night at a friend's.
Even though you had the confession, we had this rock-solid alibi that we had to deal with.
If Jamie was telling the truth, time of death became an issue.
We had a missing piece that was so important in order to make the rest of the puzzle fit together.
To verify the confession Jamie gave Bobby, Morgan calls the original medical examiner who worked on the case.
The first words out of his mouth is that it is very possible that he had made a mistake on the time of death.
The medical examiner explains that the February temperatures and the shaded area where Catherine was found helped preserve her body, which would explain the lack of decomposition. That opens the window of time surrounding Catherine's murder from 24 to 48 hours, which lines up with Bobby's story.
Once it was determined that the time of death now could be up to 48 hours, Jamie's alibi was completely gone.
But what about the gunshots heard early Saturday morning? If Catherine was killed the day before, what accounts for them?
The security guard and that student both reported fireworks or firecrackers. After her body was discovered, all of a sudden it became, well, they were probably gunshots. And so when you turn fireworks into gunshots, that got the course of the investigation on the wrong path right off the bat.
The only way to confirm if Bobby is telling them the truth is to get their hands on Jamie's confession letter. And when Sergeant Morgan starts asking around, he hears that her stepfather may have a copy.
When I first learned that Jamie's stepfather had actually seen a letter that Jamie had written, I immediately wanted to go speak to him. His response was, "You mean the letter?" Obviously, I was very intrigued, and I'm like, "Yes, the letter." So he goes, "I tell you what, I'll let you read it." He said, "Come with me." And he had a locker. He unlocked it, and sure enough, in there is this letter that Jamie had written to Catherine. The letter began, "Dear Catherine, after all these years, I've come
to you. It's me, Jamie, the girl who took your life.
The motive in this case was pure jealousy. Jamie Kellum Letson had been in love with Jake, the boyfriend of Catherine Foster. She felt like if Catherine wasn't in the way, she may actually have a chance with Jake.
Catherine, come on.
The hairs on the back of your neck, the tingling sensation that after all of those years, and it came down to that first sentence in that letter.
Nearly 30 years have passed when on November 21st, 2008, Jamie Letson is finally arrested for Catherine's murder.
It was a great day. It was very, very satisfying when we actually got to her and put handcuffs on her.
Now, I was present when Jamie gave her confession. It seemed to be something that she wanted to get off her chest, probably had for a long time.
I know y'all must think I'm a terrible, terrible person.
Jamie explains in chilling detail how she pulled the trigger on her best friend. Somehow, Catherine was able to turn and look at Jamie, staring into her friend's eyes as her life was ending.
In Jamie's own words, Jamie described that Catherine had this shocked look on her face. Jamie described all she heard was this loud roar in her own head and knew that she had to get out of there. And that's when she shot her the second time and then fled.
She does admit that the second shot was to kill her, that she didn't die after the first shot.
When news gets out, no one can believe the shocking truth, especially Catherine Foster's parents.
Jamie was there at the funeral. Miss Foster had a very, very difficult time believing that this woman that came over and grieved with them could actually be responsible for Catherine's murder.
In the end, Jamie is simply a cold, calculating killer.
And the reality is, there was just this girl that was staying in the dorm right next door, just wanted her boyfriend. And at the end of the day, it just became, I want something that you have, and I'm going to kill you to get it.
At trial, in one final twist, Jamie pleads not guilty, even though she's already confessed to her crime.
The defense's main theory was that Louis Shea, the security guard, was the one that had actually killed Catherine.
The jury isn't buying it. Louis Shea is completely cleared of any involvement. On May 27, 2010, Jamie Kellum Letson is found guilty of murder in the first degree. She is sentenced to life in prison.
The bottom line is that justice was finally served. It took 30 years. I wish it hadn't, but it did.
In my career, in my life, this is a significant event. Probably the most serious crime I've ever been involved in. I was responsible for the safety of that campus and those students. Yeah.
Because it was such an old case, when we finally reopened this investigation and it sought an arrest warrant, it was a bit of a shock. The university campus can be a place that is certainly safe, but it was destroyed by this one act of violence.
Nobody could have dreamed something like this in a community like Mobile on a campus like South Alabama to a lovely young girl like Catherine.
I hope the foster family has closure. That term is thrown out a lot. The reality is their daughter was still murdered, but I hope that they at least have peace that there was finally an answer that they did not have for so many years.
The crime scene did not look like the beginning of a mystery that would survive nearly half a century. It looked like the end of an ordinary Friday. A quiet neighborhood in Oklahoma City. A modest home. Familiar streets where neighbors recognized one another by sight. Nothing about that spring day suggested that investigators were about to step into one of the city's most haunting unsolved homicide cases, a case that would remain suspended between evidence and silence for decades before science finally illuminated a name hidden in the shadows. On May 14, 1976, 68-year-old Lela Johnston was supposed to spend the day much as she always did. Friends and relatives knew her as a woman whose routines rarely changed. She had built a life defined not by headlines or public attention, but by simple habits, familiar faces, and the comfort of ordinary days. That ordinary rhythm ended violently inside her own home. When concern grew after family members were unable to reach her, someone went to check on the residence. What they encountered was every family's nightmare. Lela Johnston had been brutally assaulted and murdered. The home, once a place of comfort and security, had become the center of a homicide investigation that immediately shocked investigators and devastated those who knew her. Police officers arriving at the scene quickly realized they were dealing with more than a burglary gone wrong. The evidence pointed toward a violent sexual assault followed by murder. Detectives secured the residence, documented every room, photographed every visible detail, and began the painstaking work that every homicide investigation demands. Every fingerprint mattered. Every footprint mattered. Every fiber, every hair, every drop of biological evidence had the potential to identify whoever had entered that house with deadly intent. The challenge facing investigators in 1976 was one shared by law enforcement agencies across America. DNA profiling did not yet exist. Genetic genealogy had not even entered the imagination of criminal investigators. Detectives relied on witness statements, fingerprints, blood typing, physical evidence, neighborhood interviews, and intuition developed through years of experience. The cases were solved because someone talked, someone made a mistake, or someone recognized a familiar face. When those pieces failed to come together, justice often drifted farther away with each passing year. Neighbors described the neighborhood as peaceful. Nothing suggested that a predator had been waiting nearby. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors one after another, asking the same questions repeatedly. Had anyone seen an unfamiliar vehicle? Had anyone heard screams? Did anyone notice suspicious activity during the day? The answers were frustratingly ordinary. Most residents remembered nothing unusual. Others recalled seeing vehicles, but could not describe them with confidence. Hours became days. Days became weeks. Investigators examined Lela Johnston's personal life in meticulous detail. Detectives always begin with the victim. Who knew her? Who visited her regularly? Had anyone threatened her? Was there financial conflict? Family disagreement? A recent argument? Every relationship was reviewed because experience had taught investigators that answers often hide within the victim's closest circles. Nothing immediately pointed toward a clear suspect. The investigation expanded. Friends were interviewed. Relatives were interviewed. Individuals with criminal histories in the area were questioned. Detectives explored the possibility that the attack had been random, as well as the possibility that the killer knew exactly whose home had been targeted. Every theory carried weaknesses. Every lead seemed to dissolve before reaching certainty. Meanwhile, forensic specialists carefully preserved biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. At the time, no one could have predicted that these samples would outlive generations of detectives and eventually become the most important witnesses in the case. They were carefully collected because experienced investigators understood a simple truth: technology changes. Evidence cannot be recreated once lost. That decision would ultimately become one of the most important moments in the history of the investigation, although no one standing inside that Oklahoma City home in 1976 could possibly have known it. As weeks passed without an arrest, anxiety spread beyond Lela Johnston's family. Violent crimes against elderly victims carried a particular emotional weight. Residents locked their doors earlier. Conversations at grocery stores shifted toward fear instead of familiarity. Parents warned children to stay close to home. Rumors circulated faster than verified facts. Every unfamiliar face became a possible suspect in someone's imagination. The detectives assigned to the case refused to let public pressure dictate their work. Instead, they returned repeatedly to the evidence already collected. Crime scene photographs were reviewed again. Interview notes were reread. Timelines were reconstructed. Sometimes the smallest overlooked inconsistency becomes the thread that unravels an entire homicide. Sometimes it does not. In this investigation, certainty remained painfully out of reach. Months turned into years.
Personnel changed.
Detectives retired. New investigators inherited shelves of reports written by officers they had never met. Cardboard boxes filled with photographs, laboratory reports, interview transcripts, handwritten notes, and evidence logs became the physical memory of the investigation. Every new detective faced the same difficult question. What had everyone else missed? Cold cases occupy a unique place within law enforcement. Unlike active investigations dominated by constant developments, a cold case exists in suspended animation. The evidence remains. The victim remains. The questions remain. Only time continues moving forward. For Lela Johnston's family, birthdays arrived without answers. Holidays passed without closure. Every anniversary of the murder reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Hope faded gradually, not because they stopped caring, but because every passing year made resolution appear increasingly unlikely. Across the United States, thousands of homicide investigations entered similar limbo during the 1970s and 1980s. Detectives often believed they knew who might be responsible, but lacked sufficient evidence for prosecution. Others had evidence, but no identifiable suspect. Some cases simply disappeared beneath the growing workload of new violent crimes demanding immediate attention. Lela Johnston's murder remained among those unresolved files. Then criminal investigation entered a scientific revolution. During the late 20th century, DNA profiling transformed homicide investigations. Biological evidence that once revealed only limited information suddenly possessed extraordinary identification power. Cases previously considered unsolvable began producing arrests years after the crimes occurred. Like countless law enforcement agencies nationwide, the Oklahoma City Police Department revisited older investigations containing preserved biological evidence. Detectives understood that yesterday's impossible case might become tomorrow's successful prosecution. Lela Johnston's case was among those reviewed. The preserved biological evidence collected in 1976 was submitted for modern DNA analysis. For investigators who had spent years waiting for technological advances, this represented genuine optimism. If a usable genetic profile could be developed, perhaps it could be compared against offenders already entered into national databases. The laboratory succeeded in developing a DNA profile connected to the crime. It was a remarkable scientific achievement considering the age of the evidence. The profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, better known as CODIS, the national database designed to compare crime scene DNA against profiles from convicted offenders and other qualifying samples. Investigators waited. No match appeared. The silence that followed was almost as frustrating as the decades that had preceded it. The DNA profile existed. It belonged to someone. Yet, whoever had left it behind either had never entered the database or could not be identified through the technology available at that time. The investigation once again reached an impasse. But unlike the detectives of 1976, investigators now possessed something extraordinarily valuable. They no longer had only theories. They had the genetic signature of the individual connected to one of Oklahoma City's oldest unsolved murders. The identity behind that profile remained unknown. For years, it waited inside an evidence file, preserved with extraordinary care while forensic science continued advancing beyond anything investigators from the original crime scene could ever have imagined. Every breakthrough in genetics, every improvement in laboratory methods, every successful cold case solved elsewhere in the country quietly reshaped the possibilities surrounding Lela Johnston's murder. The case was no longer waiting for another witness. It was waiting for the future. The future arrived not with flashing lights or a dramatic confession, but through decades of quiet scientific progress. While detectives continued to reopen dusty boxes, forensic laboratories across the United States were rewriting the rules of criminal investigation. Cases once considered impossible slowly began yielding answers. Biological evidence that had waited in storage for years suddenly carried a new kind of voice. It could identify strangers, reconstruct forgotten connections, and, in some investigations, lead detectives toward people who had never been questioned during the original inquiry. For investigators assigned to Lela Johnston's case, every breakthrough elsewhere in the country offered a measure of hope. They watched headlines announcing decades-old murders finally solved through DNA technology. Families who had spent 30 or 40 years without answers suddenly learned the names of those responsible. Those successes carried an important message for every cold case unit. Preserving evidence had been worth the effort. Still, hope alone could not solve a murder. The DNA profile developed from the biological evidence remained unmatched inside CODIS. Detectives knew exactly what that meant. The person whose DNA had been recovered from the crime scene was not identifiable through the national database. That did not prove innocence. It simply meant the system had reached its limit. For many investigations, that would have been the end of the road. But forensic science was changing again. During the following years, investigators around the country began exploring a technique that would eventually transform cold case investigations: investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional database searches that looked for an exact DNA match, this approach searched for relatives whose genetic information suggested a shared family line. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" detectives could begin asking, "Who might this person be related to?" The process was anything but simple. It required highly specialized laboratory work, extensive genealogical research, historical records, public documents, census information, marriage certificates, birth records, military files, newspaper archives, cemetery records, and thousands of hours spent constructing family trees that stretched across generations. One distant cousin could become the first thread. A second relative might narrow the possibilities. A third connection could eliminate entire branches of a family. Piece by piece, investigators could move closer to an individual who had never appeared in police records. The Oklahoma City Police Department recognized the potential of this rapidly developing field. Detectives responsible for unsolved homicides began reviewing older investigations that still contained viable biological evidence. Lela Johnston's murder immediately stood out. The case had preserved forensic material, a confirmed DNA profile, and decades of unanswered questions. Technology had finally caught up with the evidence collected in 1976. By this point, nearly everyone directly affected by the original investigation had experienced the relentless passage of time. Detectives who first walked through Lela Johnston's home had long since retired. Some had passed away. Laboratory techniques they once considered unimaginable had become routine. Entire careers in forensic science had developed between the murder itself and this renewed investigation. Yet the victim remained the same. The evidence remained the same. Only the tools had changed. Cold case investigators approached the file with fresh eyes. Unlike the original detectives, they possessed the benefit of hindsight. They knew which early theories had failed. They knew which suspects had been eliminated. They understood where investigative assumptions had reached dead ends. Most importantly, they had access to technology unavailable to anyone in 1976. This combination of old evidence and modern science has become one of the defining characteristics of successful cold case investigations across America. The biological evidence underwent additional forensic processing designed specifically for genealogical analysis. Specialists extracted far more genetic information than traditional law enforcement databases required. Instead of producing only a profile suitable for Cody's comparisons, laboratories developed a broader genetic dataset capable of identifying familial relationships. The work demanded extraordinary precision. Unlike television dramas that often compress months into minutes, real forensic genealogy moves deliberately. Every conclusion requires independent verification. Every document must support another. A single incorrect assumption can send investigators down an entirely false path. Genealogists began assembling family histories. Names appeared, then disappeared. Branches expanded. Entire generations had to be traced across decades. Families moved from one state to another. People married, remarried, changed surnames, died, left few records behind, or left hundreds. Each discovery generated new questions. Investigators worked alongside genealogical specialists, comparing historical timelines with known facts surrounding Lela Johnston's murder. They examined ages, residences, occupations, family relationships, and geographic connections. The objective was never to force evidence toward a preferred suspect. Instead, the evidence itself determined which individuals remained possible and which could confidently be eliminated. As the research progressed, one family line began attracting increasing attention. The process did not instantly identify a killer. Instead, it dramatically reduced the number of possibilities. Detectives continued gathering independent evidence before reaching any conclusions. They compared historical addresses. They reviewed employment information. They searched public records that had not existed in searchable digital form during the original investigation. Newspaper archives became valuable resources. Property records revealed movements across counties and states. Every available document added another piece to an increasingly detailed historical puzzle. Eventually, one name emerged with growing significance.
Charlie Zodrock.
For investigators, identifying a possible suspect after nearly 5 decades represented a remarkable development. Yet they also understood that identifying someone through genealogical investigation was only part of the process. The scientific analysis generated an investigative lead, not a criminal conviction. Every conclusion required confirmation. Detectives began reconstructing Droke's life as thoroughly as they had reconstructed Lela Johnston's final day. Where had he lived? Where had he worked? What was his connection, if any, to Oklahoma City? Could he realistically have been present near the victim during the time of the murder? Historical records gradually answered those questions. As investigators continued reviewing available information, another fact emerged that fundamentally changed the direction of the case. Charles O. Droke had died in 1989. The revelation carried mixed emotions. On one hand, investigators believed they were finally approaching the identity of the individual connected to the DNA evidence recovered nearly half a century earlier. On the other hand, the possibility of a criminal prosecution had vanished decades earlier. No arrest would occur. No interrogation would take place. No courtroom testimony would be heard. No jury would evaluate the evidence. The investigation had shifted from pursuing justice through prosecution to pursuing truth through evidence. That distinction matters deeply in cold cases. Families often describe two separate needs. The first is accountability. The second is answers. When prosecution is no longer possible because a suspect has died, investigators focus on establishing the historical truth as accurately as the available evidence allows. Detectives continued working carefully. They sought additional forensic confirmation. Scientific conclusions had to withstand scrutiny, particularly in a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 50 years. Every laboratory procedure underwent review. Documentation was examined repeatedly. Independent verification remained essential. The Oklahoma City Police Department understood that announcing the resolution of such a historic case required absolute confidence in both the science and the investigative process. This was no longer simply another homicide investigation. It had become a demonstration of how modern forensic science could reach across generations. Every detective who had preserved evidence. Every laboratory technician who had protected biological samples. Every investigator who refused to close the file permanently. Every scientific advancement made during the intervening decades. All of those efforts converged toward a single objective: determining whether the evidence collected inside Lela Johnston's home in May 1976 could finally identify the person responsible for one of Oklahoma City's oldest unresolved murders. For nearly 47 years, the evidence had remained silent. Now, for the first time, it appeared ready to tell investigators exactly where to look. The name alone was never enough. Experienced homicide investigators understood that better than anyone, a promising lead could open a door, but it could not close a case. Before the Oklahoma City Police Department could publicly identify Charles O. Droke as the man responsible for Lela Johnston's murder, every conclusion had to withstand the weight of scientific scrutiny, legal review, and decades of accumulated investigative records. After 47 years, there was no room for assumption. Every statement would need to rest on evidence. Detectives returned once again to the original case file. Photographs taken inside Lela Johnston's home in May 1976 were examined with modern perspective. Every report written by the first responding officers was reread. Laboratory notes prepared decades earlier were compared with contemporary forensic findings. Witness interviews that had once produced little investigative value were reviewed, not because investigators expected forgotten confessions to emerge, but because even the smallest historical detail could reinforce or challenge the developing picture. Cold case work rarely resembles the dramatic pace portrayed in fiction. It is methodical. It is repetitive. Investigators often spend days reviewing documents they have already read multiple times. Every date is verified. Every address is checked. Every chain of custody record is examined. A single discrepancy can undermine years of work if left unexplained. The evidence preserved from the crime scene remained the foundation of the investigation. The DNA profile developed from biological material recovered during the original forensic examination had already excluded countless possibilities. It had survived decades of storage, advances in laboratory science, and repeated review. Investigative genetic genealogy had pointed detectives toward Charles O. Droke, but genealogy itself was never intended to function as courtroom proof. Instead, It served as a powerful investigative tool, guiding detectives toward an individual whose identity could then be evaluated through additional evidence. Investigators worked to determine whether every available fact aligned with that conclusion. Historical records placed Droke in Oklahoma during the relevant period. Public documents, employment information, and residential history became pieces of a timeline reconstructed nearly half a century after the crime. Detectives searched for inconsistencies. They looked for reasons to reject the theory as aggressively as they searched for reasons to support it. Eliminating error was just as important as finding confirmation. That careful approach reflected an important reality. Unlike an active homicide investigation, there would be no opportunity to interview the suspect. Charles O. Droke had died in 1989. His death meant investigators would never hear his explanation, denial, or confession. No search warrant could recover additional statements. No interrogation could clarify unanswered questions. The physical evidence and historical record would have to speak for themselves. For Lela Johnston's family, that reality carried complicated emotions. For decades, they had lived with uncertainty. Every anniversary of the murder renewed painful questions. Who had entered her home? Why had she been targeted? Had the killer continued living an ordinary life afterward? Had investigators unknowingly crossed paths with him? Those questions had lingered without resolution through changing administrations, changing detectives, and changing generations. Now, science appeared to offer an answer, but one that arrived too late for a criminal trial. Even so, identifying the person responsible represented a profound shift. An unsolved murder leaves a permanent void. Families often describe the absence of answers as a second tragedy, one that continues long after the funeral ends. The inability to name the person responsible prevents emotional closure and leaves every memory suspended in uncertainty. Cold case investigators understand that solving a case is not measured only by arrests. Sometimes justice takes the form of truth. As detectives prepared their findings, forensic specialists independently reviewed laboratory procedures. Genealogical research underwent additional verification. The objective was simple: ensure that every conclusion could withstand public scrutiny. Cases solved through investigative genetic genealogy have transformed criminal investigations across the United States, but agencies recognize the importance of transparency and careful documentation. Public confidence depends not only on scientific capability, but also on the integrity of the investigative process. The Oklahoma City Police Department ultimately concluded that the combined forensic evidence identified Charles O. Droke as the individual responsible for the rape and murder of Lela Johnston. The announcement marked the end of one of the city's oldest unresolved homicide investigations. For investigators, it represented the culmination of nearly 5 decades of persistence. For forensic scientists, it demonstrated how evidence collected in an era before DNA profiling could still produce answers generations later. For the community, it served as a reminder that time does not erase a homicide. A case may grow cold, witnesses may disappear, detectives may retire, but carefully preserved evidence can continue waiting for the technology capable of revealing its significance. The resolution also highlighted a lesson shared by many successful cold case investigations. The detectives who first entered Lela Johnston's home in 1976 could not foresee DNA profiling. They could not imagine national genetic databases. They could not have predicted investigative genetic genealogy. Yet they preserved biological evidence with extraordinary care because they understood a principle that remains central to homicide work today: never assume that today's limitations will exist forever. That decision ultimately bridged 47 years. The investigation became more than the story of a single crime. It became a story about institutional memory, about evidence maintained across generations, about investigators who inherited responsibility for victims they had never met, and about scientific progress that transformed forgotten fragments into compelling proof. Lela Johnston never saw justice in the traditional sense. No courtroom verdict followed. No sentence was imposed. No opportunity existed for cross-examination or appeal. Instead, the case concluded through the convergence of diligent police work, preserved forensic evidence, and advances in genetic science. The file that had remained open for decades could finally be marked as solved. Yet, even with that resolution, certain questions remain beyond the reach of evidence. Investigators have publicly identified the person responsible, but motives often disappear with time. The precise sequence of decisions leading to the attack, the thoughts that preceded it, and the reasons Lela Johnston became the victim on that day in May 1976 are questions that likely died with the offender himself. Some mysteries survive even after a case is solved. That is one of the enduring realities of homicide investigation. Evidence can establish identity. Science can reconstruct events. Records can reveal movements. But the inner motivations of a killer are not always preserved for history. What remains, instead, is the certainty that nearly half a century after Lela Johnston's life was taken, the relentless commitment of investigators and the evolution of forensic science finally restored one essential truth. Her name would no longer be attached to an unsolved case, and the silence that had surrounded her murder for 47 years had, at last, been broken. Although investigators had reached a conclusion supported by modern forensic science, the announcement that followed was not treated as the triumphant ending often portrayed in crime dramas. There were no handcuffs, no televised arrest, no dramatic courtroom confrontation. Instead, there was a carefully prepared statement, the product of months of scientific review, legal consultation, and investigative verification. Every word mattered. After nearly half a century, the Oklahoma City Police Department understood that the public deserved accuracy more than spectacle. When officials disclosed that Lela Johnston's murder had been solved through investigative genetic genealogy, the reaction spread quickly throughout Oklahoma City. For many residents, the case belonged to another era. Some had never heard Lela Johnston's name before the announcement. Others remembered the fear that followed the murder in 1976, recalling newspaper headlines, neighborhood conversations, and the unsettling realization that someone capable of extraordinary violence had disappeared without being identified. For Johnston's surviving relatives, the news arrived with emotions that defied simple description. Relief was certainly present. So was sorrow. Nearly 5 decades had passed since the day their lives changed forever. During those years, family members had experienced weddings, funerals, births, retirements, and countless ordinary moments while carrying an unanswered question that quietly followed them through every stage of life. Who killed Lela Johnston? Now, they finally had an answer. But answers arriving after 47 years cannot restore what was taken. They cannot return conversations never finished. They cannot erase decades of uncertainty. They cannot allow loved ones who died before the case was solved to witness its conclusion. Cold case investigators often speak about resolution rather than closure. The distinction is important. Closure suggests that grief ends. For most families, it never does. Resolution means something different. It means replacing uncertainty with established fact. It means that history no longer ends with the word unknown. It means investigators can finally tell a victim's family that every available piece of evidence has been pursued as far as modern science allows. The announcement also drew attention far beyond Oklahoma. Law enforcement agencies across the United States had increasingly embraced investigative genetic genealogy following a series of successful cold case breakthroughs. The technique had already demonstrated its ability to identify suspects in murders, sexual assaults, and unidentified human remains that had resisted traditional investigative methods for decades. Lela Johnston's case became another example of how preserved forensic evidence could acquire entirely new significance as technology advanced. Yet investigators were careful to explain what genetic genealogy actually does. Contrary to popular belief, the technique does not simply produce a suspect's name with the click of a button. The process is painstaking. Scientists first develop a specialized DNA profile suitable for genealogical comparison. Researchers then identify distant biological relatives whose genetic information suggests shared ancestry. From there, trained genealogists construct extensive family trees, often stretching back multiple generations before moving forward again through descendants. Thousands of historical records may be examined. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, military records, obituaries, newspaper archives, property documents, census information. Every relationship must be verified. Every branch must be explored. Only after investigators narrow the possibilities through extensive historical research do they focus on a single individual. Even then, additional evidence must support that conclusion before law enforcement announces the results publicly. It is investigative work strengthened by genetics, not replaced by it. The Johnston investigation reflected exactly that philosophy. The original detectives had preserved evidence. Forensic scientists had developed a usable DNA profile decades later. The profile failed to match anyone in Cody's. Only then did investigators turn toward genealogical analysis. Each stage depended upon the previous one. Without the crime scene investigators of 1976, there would have been no biological evidence to examine. Without the forensic laboratories that successfully extracted DNA years later, there would have been no profile to analyze. Without advances in genealogy, the profile might have remained anonymous indefinitely. Each generation of investigators unknowingly contributed to solving the same crime. That continuity represents one of the most remarkable aspects of cold case work. Police officers rarely solve every investigation during their own careers. Sometimes they preserve opportunities for detectives they will never meet. Sometimes they collect evidence whose true importance will not become apparent for decades. Lela Johnston's case illustrated precisely that reality. The evidence waited patiently while science caught up. As news organizations reported the case, many emphasized another striking fact. The identified suspect, Charles O. Droke, had died in 1989. That detail inevitably prompted questions. Could investigators have identified him earlier if DNA technology had existed? Would an arrest have been possible? Would additional victims have come forward? Those questions cannot be answered with certainty. Investigators generally avoid speculation because responsible homicide work depends upon evidence rather than imagination. What they could state confidently was this: the available forensic evidence and genealogical investigation allowed them to identify Droke decades after his death, bringing factual resolution to the case even though criminal prosecution was no longer possible. The announcement also underscored another important principle. Cold cases are not abandoned cases. Popular culture often portrays unsolved investigations as forgotten boxes collecting dust inside police storage rooms. Reality is considerably different. Most law enforcement agencies maintain dedicated cold case programs that periodically review older investigations whenever new technology becomes available. Detectives revisit evidence, request additional laboratory testing, compare unsolved cases, and examine historical records unavailable during the original inquiry. Progress is often invisible to the public. Years may pass without announcements. Behind the scenes, however, investigators continue working. The Johnston case reflected exactly that persistence. The file remained active because investigators believed future scientific advances might eventually reveal what contemporary methods could not. That belief proved justified. Beyond its investigative significance, the case also contributed to broader discussions within forensic science. How long should biological evidence be preserved? What standards should govern evidence storage? How can agencies ensure future investigators inherit complete documentation? Cases like this provide compelling answers. Evidence, once considered exhausted, may acquire new value decades later. Technological limitations are temporary. Proper evidence preservation can make the difference between permanent uncertainty and eventual identification. For younger detectives entering homicide units today, Lela Johnston's case has become an important reminder of professional responsibility. Every photograph matters. Every evidence envelope matters. Every notation on a property sheet matters. Every decision made during the first hours of an investigation may influence detectives working 50 years in the future. The original investigators could not solve the case with the tools available to them. What they did accomplish was equally important. They preserved the truth. That preservation allowed future generations to finish what earlier detectives had begun. As Oklahoma City reflected upon the case, another realization gradually emerged. Lela Johnston's story was no longer remembered only because of the brutality of her murder. It also became a story about perseverance, about science refusing to accept impossibility, about investigators refusing to surrender to time, about evidence quietly waiting for decades until someone finally learned how to hear what it had been saying all along. For nearly half a century, the case had been defined by a single phrase: unsolved homicide. Now, that description belonged to history rather than the present. The questions that remained were no longer about identity. Instead, they centered on legacy, how one investigation would influence countless others still waiting inside evidence rooms across the country, each carrying the silent possibility that tomorrow's science might finally answer yesterday's mystery. Long after the official announcement, the evidence itself remained unchanged. The photographs taken inside Lela Johnston's home in May 1976 looked exactly as they had nearly 5 decades earlier. The handwritten notes prepared by detectives had not rewritten themselves. The fingerprints, sketches, laboratory reports, and interview transcripts had not acquired new meaning on their own. What changed was humanity's ability to understand them. The case served as a powerful reminder that evidence does not become obsolete simply because time passes. Sometimes it waits patiently for science to catch up. Within the Oklahoma City Police Department, the successful resolution of the Johnston investigation became more than another entry in departmental history. It became a teaching case. New detectives assigned to homicide units studied how the investigation evolved across generations. They saw firsthand that every decision made during the first hours of a murder inquiry can influence investigators decades later. Proper documentation was no longer viewed merely as administrative procedure. It was viewed as an investment in the future. Experienced investigators often tell younger officers that a homicide file is never truly theirs alone. It belongs to every detective who may one day inherit it. That philosophy was reflected throughout the Johnston investigation. The officers who first secured the crime scene in 1976 never knew the names of the forensic scientists who would eventually analyze the biological evidence using technologies that had not yet been invented. Likewise, the genealogists who reconstructed family histories decades later never met the original detectives whose careful preservation of evidence made their work possible. Across 47 years, dozens of professionals contributed to solving the same crime without ever working together. Their collaboration occurred across time. That quiet continuity represents one of the most remarkable characteristics of cold case investigations. Unlike active cases that unfold over weeks or months, cold cases often become relay races spanning entire careers. One detective gathers evidence. Another preserves it. Years later, someone else re-examines it. A forensic scientist develops a new analytical method. A genealogist identifies relationships hidden inside genetic data. A prosecutor reviews the findings even when prosecution is no longer possible. Justice, in such cases, becomes a collective effort shared across generations. The Johnston investigation also underscored an uncomfortable reality. Many homicide victims never received that opportunity. Across the United States, thousands of murders remain unsolved despite exhaustive investigative efforts. Evidence may have been lost before modern preservation standards existed. Witnesses may have died. Crime scenes may have yielded little physical evidence. Some investigations occurred long before DNA technology transformed forensic science. Every cold case presents unique challenges. Not every investigation contains biological evidence suitable for modern testing. Not every preserved sample remains viable after decades. Not every DNA profile can produce a genealogical lead. For that reason, investigators resisted portraying the Johnston case as proof that every unsolved murder would eventually be solved. Instead, they described it as evidence of possibility. Scientific progress had expanded the boundaries of what law enforcement could achieve. It had not eliminated uncertainty. Investigative genetic genealogy, despite its remarkable success, remains one tool among many. It requires careful oversight, extensive documentation, and meticulous verification. Every potential identification must be supported through independent investigation before public conclusions are reached. That careful approach protects both victims and the integrity of the justice system. Throughout the Johnston investigation, detectives repeatedly emphasized that no single technological breakthrough solved the case by itself. The DNA profile mattered. The genealogical research mattered. The historical records mattered. The original crime scene processing mattered. Taken separately, none of those elements would likely have produced resolution. Together, they formed a coherent evidentiary picture strong enough to identify Charles O. Droke as the person responsible for the rape and murder of Lela Johnston. That conclusion represented decades of cumulative work rather than a single scientific discovery. As media coverage spread following the announcement, many reports focused on the extraordinary timeline. 47 years. Nearly half a century separated the crime from its resolution. Children born during the original investigation had become grandparents by the time the case was solved. Entire neighborhoods had changed. Businesses had disappeared. Roads had been rebuilt. Technology had transformed every aspect of modern life. Yet one murder investigation continued quietly waiting inside police archives until science finally provided investigators with the means to answer the question that had persisted since 1976. The passage of time gave the case an almost surreal quality. The suspect had died decades earlier. Many witnesses were no longer alive. Several investigators who originally worked the case had also passed away. The people most directly connected to the investigation had gradually disappeared, while the evidence itself remained. Unlike human memory, properly preserved forensic evidence does not grow uncertain with age. It does not forget. It simply waits. That reality has fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies view evidence preservation today. Biological samples, once considered routine, are now treated as potentially invaluable future resources. Digital record-keeping has replaced many handwritten systems. Evidence storage procedures have become increasingly standardized. Crime scene investigators understand that scientific methods available 50 years from now may reveal information unimaginable today. The Johnston case demonstrated why that long-term perspective matters. For Lela Johnston's surviving relatives, however, the investigation was never about scientific innovation alone. Behind every forensic breakthrough stood the memory of a woman whose life ended violently inside the place where she should have felt safest. Public attention often centers on the killer. Cold case investigators strive to return attention to the victim. Lela Johnston was more than a name attached to an evidence file. She was a family member, a neighbor, a friend. A woman whose ordinary life was interrupted by extraordinary violence. Her story deserved to be remembered for more than the mystery surrounding her death. By identifying the person responsible, investigators restored part of that story. The case no longer ended with unanswered questions. Instead, it became an example of perseverance overcoming time. Not through luck, not through coincidence, but through disciplined investigative work sustained across decades. Looking back today, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Johnston investigation is not the sophistication of modern DNA analysis or the complexity of investigative genetic genealogy. It is the determination reflected in every generation of professionals who refused to accept that 47 years was simply too long. Every detective who reopened the file rejected the idea that age alone should determine whether a victim receives answers. Every forensic scientist who re-examined the evidence believed that another attempt might succeed where previous efforts had failed. Every genealogist who traced forgotten family branches understood that somewhere inside historical records, the truth still existed. Together, those efforts transformed one of Oklahoma City's oldest unsolved murders into one of its most significant cold case resolutions. The investigation closed without a trial, without a confession, without the dramatic courtroom scenes often associated with justice. Instead, it ended in a quieter but equally profound way. A name was finally placed where, for decades, there had been only uncertainty. The silence that had surrounded Lela Johnston's murder was broken not by speculation, but by evidence. And in the end, that is perhaps the most enduring lesson left behind by this remarkable case. Time can delay justice. It can obscure memories. It can scatter witnesses and reshape entire communities. But when evidence is preserved, when investigators refuse to abandon hope, and when science continues to advance, even the longest silence may one day give way to the truth. For decades after Lela Johnston's murder, the case occupied a quiet corner of the Oklahoma City Police Department's archives. The boxes containing photographs, laboratory reports, handwritten notes, evidence logs, and interview transcripts no longer moved from desk to desk with the urgency of an active homicide. Instead, they became part of a growing collection of investigations waiting for something that could not be manufactured through determination alone. They were waiting for opportunity. They were waiting for technology. Most of all, they were waiting for someone willing to believe that a 47-year-old crime still deserved the same attention as one committed yesterday. That belief has become the defining philosophy of modern cold case investigations. Across the United States, police agencies have increasingly recognized that the passage of time changes an investigation in two very different ways. On one hand, every passing year removes witnesses, fades memories, and closes opportunities that once existed. On the other hand, every passing year also introduces new forensic techniques, new analytical methods, and new scientific capabilities that investigators of an earlier generation could never have imagined. The Johnston investigation reflected both realities simultaneously. When detectives first entered her home in 1976, they relied on the best methods available at the time. Crime scene photography was meticulous. Physical evidence was carefully collected. Laboratory analysis followed accepted scientific standards. Investigators interviewed neighbors, reviewed possible suspects, and reconstructed the victim's final known movements as thoroughly as possible. No one failed to do their job. They simply reached the limits of contemporary science. That distinction matters because cold cases are often misunderstood. Public perception sometimes assumes that an unsolved investigation reflects neglect or incompetence. In reality, many of the nation's oldest homicide cases remained unresolved for one simple reason: the necessary technology had not yet been invented. DNA profiling would not become a routine investigative tool until years later. National DNA databases did not exist. Investigative genetic genealogy was still decades away. The evidence collected in Lela Johnston's home therefore became something extraordinary. It was evidence preserved for a future no one could yet describe. When investigators eventually identified Charles O. Through modern forensic techniques, the case demonstrated something far larger than a single investigative success. It showed that careful evidence preservation can extend an investigation across generations without compromising its integrity. Every homicide detective understands that evidence is the only witness whose memory does not fade. Human recollection changes. Documents can be misplaced. Witnesses relocate.
Suspectstí.
Evidence, if preserved correctly, continues telling the same story year after year. That principle guided every stage of the Johnston investigation. The biological evidence collected in 1976 remained scientifically valuable nearly 5 decades later because investigators treated it with care from the very beginning. That decision was not extraordinary for its time. It was simply good police work. Yet good police work performed consistently across generations became the foundation upon which future scientific breakthroughs could succeed. Another lesson emerged from the case as investigators publicly discussed how it had finally been solved. Patience. Modern forensic investigations often appear instantaneous in popular culture. Television audiences see DNA results arrive within hours. Genealogists identify suspects in a matter of minutes. Detectives confront offenders before the end of a single episode. Reality unfolds differently. The Johnston investigation illustrates how painstaking the process truly is. Laboratory scientists spent months generating high-quality genetic profiles. Genealogists invested countless hours building and verifying family trees. Detectives compared historical records from multiple jurisdictions. Supervisors reviewed investigative findings. Legal advisors examined documentation. Independent verification occurred before any announcement reached the public. Nothing about the process was rushed. That deliberate pace protected the credibility of the final conclusion. Accuracy mattered more than speed. By the time investigators identified Charles O. Droke as the person responsible, every available line of evidence had been examined repeatedly. Although prosecution was impossible because Droke had died decades earlier, the standard applied by investigators remained exceptionally high. Naming an individual publicly required confidence grounded in evidence rather than probability. The investigation, therefore, became an example of responsible forensic practice. As interest in investigative genetic genealogy continued growing nationwide, experts frequently cited cases like Johnston's when explaining why scientific innovation must always remain connected to careful investigative work. DNA alone cannot explain motive. DNA alone cannot reconstruct every event. DNA alone cannot replace traditional detective work. Instead, it functions as one component within a much larger investigative framework. The Johnston case demonstrated precisely that balance. Historical records established timelines. Detective work eliminated alternative possibilities. Forensic science identified biological connections. Genealogical research narrowed the search. Together, those elements produced a conclusion that none could have achieved independently. For criminologists and forensic researchers, the investigation also highlighted another important reality. Many cold cases remain unsolved not because evidence is absent, but because available technology has not yet extracted every answer contained within that evidence. That possibility continues driving research throughout forensic science. Improved DNA sequencing. Advanced trace evidence analysis. Digital reconstruction techniques. Artificial intelligence capable of organizing massive investigative databases. Each advancement creates new opportunities to revisit cases once considered impossible. The Johnston investigation stands as a reminder that scientific progress often changes yesterday's conclusions. What seemed unknowable in one decade may become measurable in the next. That philosophy now shapes cold case units across the country. Instead of asking whether an investigation is old, detectives increasingly ask a different question. Has science changed since the last review? If the answer is yes, another opportunity may exist. Lella Johnston's case answered that question emphatically. The evidence had not changed. Science had. For surviving family members, those scientific developments translated into something profoundly human. Knowledge. For 47 years, they had lived with uncertainty. Uncertainty has its own weight. It influences memories. It reshapes grief. It leaves every family gathering with an empty space occupied by unanswered questions. Identifying the person responsible did not erase decades of pain, but it replaced uncertainty with documented fact. Investigators could finally explain what the evidence revealed instead of explaining why the case remained unsolved. That transition carries enormous emotional significance for families affected by violent crime. Many relatives of homicide victims describe uncertainty as a wound that never fully heals. Questions repeat endlessly. Was the killer ever questioned? Did investigators miss something? Will anyone ever know the truth? The Johnston investigation demonstrated that, sometimes, those questions can receive answers long after hope appears exhausted. Not because investigators became lucky. Not because someone unexpectedly confessed. But because evidence preserved with care met technology developed with patience. The resolution of Lella Johnston's murder therefore extends beyond one investigation. It speaks to every unopened evidence box stored inside police property rooms. It speaks to every detective who refuses to discard an old theory without testing it against new science. It speaks to every family waiting for a telephone call they fear may never come. Most importantly, it speaks for victims whose stories deserve to be remembered regardless of how much time has passed. 47 years separated the crime from its resolution. That span of time transformed cities, changed generations, and revolutionized forensic science. Yet it never diminished the obligation to seek the truth. Lella Johnston's name remained inside the files because investigators believed that unanswered questions should never become forgotten questions. Eventually, science rewarded that belief. And through that achievement, one of Oklahoma City's oldest cold cases became enduring proof that while time may slow the pursuit of justice, it does not necessarily end it. As the investigation into Lella Johnston's murder moved from an active homicide to a historical case study, its significance reached far beyond Oklahoma City. Law enforcement agencies across the United States were confronting the same difficult question: what should be done with murders that had resisted every available investigative method for decades? Shelves filled with unsolved case files represented more than administrative records. Each folder contained a victim, a family, and a promise that justice had never been abandoned, even when progress appeared impossible. For years, cold case detectives had argued that unsolved murders should not be measured by the age of the investigation, but by the quality of the evidence still available. Lella Johnston's case became one of the strongest demonstrations of that philosophy. The biological evidence recovered in 1976 had survived long enough to be examined by technologies that did not exist when it was collected. That single fact reshaped the way many investigators viewed long-term evidence preservation. Within police departments, the case reinforced an important professional lesson. Every crime scene belongs not only to the investigators working it today, but also to those who may inherit it decades later. A fingerprint lifted with care. A biological sample packaged correctly. A detailed sketch of a room. Accurate notes describing the exact location of evidence. These tasks may seem routine during the exhausting first hours of a homicide investigation. Yet years later, they often become the foundation upon which entirely new scientific techniques are applied. The Johnston investigation illustrated this principle with remarkable clarity. Nothing about the original evidence collection suggested extraordinary foresight. The detectives simply followed accepted investigative procedures with discipline and precision. Their professionalism preserved opportunities for future investigators they would never meet. As forensic experts later explained, evidence cannot answer questions that were never asked, but it can answer new questions when science evolves. That distinction explains why so many cold cases have been reopened in recent years. Detectives are no longer looking at old evidence through old methods. They are applying entirely new analytical tools to information that has remained unchanged for decades. This shift has transformed the philosophy of homicide investigation. Instead of asking whether a case is too old to solve, investigators increasingly ask whether current technology is capable of revealing something previous generations could not detect. Lella Johnston's case answered that question decisively. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of institutional memory. Police departments inevitably experience turnover. Detectives retire. Supervisors move into different assignments. New recruits enter the profession with no personal connection to crimes committed decades earlier. Without careful record-keeping, valuable investigative knowledge can disappear alongside those who originally possessed it. The Johnston file survived because documentation survived. Interview summaries remained intact. Evidence inventories remained complete. Laboratory records remained accessible. Every transfer of responsibility was documented. When modern investigators reopened the case, they inherited not fragments, but a coherent investigative history stretching back to 1976. That continuity proved invaluable. It allowed detectives to distinguish verified facts from speculation. It helped them understand why certain investigative paths had been exhausted while others remained open. Most importantly, it enabled them to integrate modern forensic discoveries into an already well-documented case, rather than starting from the beginning. For criminologists, the investigation has become an example of how traditional detective work and advanced forensic science complement one another. Neither replaces the other. Without careful crime scene investigation, there would have been no biological evidence suitable for DNA analysis. Without modern forensic laboratories, the preserved evidence would have remained anonymous. Without genealogical research, investigators might never have connected the DNA profile to Charles O. Droke. Without historical investigative records, detectives would have struggled to verify the broader circumstances surrounding the case. Every stage depended upon every stage that came before it. This layered approach reflects the reality of successful cold case investigations. Public fascination with DNA often creates the impression that science alone solves crimes. Investigators know the truth is more complicated. Scientific evidence provides extraordinary precision, but it must always be interpreted within the broader context of an investigation. Timelines, witness statements, historical records, and physical evidence remain essential components of establishing what occurred. The Johnston investigation, therefore, stands as a model of multidisciplinary cooperation rather than technological replacement. As the case gained national attention, it also encouraged renewed interest in other unsolved homicides throughout Oklahoma. Families whose loved ones remained unidentified or whose killers had never been found saw renewed reason for cautious optimism. They understood that every case presents unique challenges and that not all investigations contain viable biological evidence. Nevertheless, the successful resolution of a 47-year-old homicide demonstrated that the passage of time alone does not eliminate the possibility of answers. Cold case detectives frequently emphasize that hope should be realistic rather than guaranteed. Some investigations may never be solved because evidence has been destroyed or never existed in the first place. Some offenders remain impossible to identify despite extensive forensic testing. Others may require scientific capabilities that have yet to be developed. Even so, the Johnston investigation proved that perseverance combined with advancing technology can produce results once considered unattainable. The emotional impact of the case extended beyond investigative circles. For surviving relatives, public recognition that Lella Johnston's murder had been solved affirmed something they had believed for decades: her life had not been forgotten. Every press conference, every official statement, Every media report discussing the investigation placed her name back into public memory. Instead of being remembered only as the victim of an unsolved crime, she became part of a larger story about determination, scientific progress, and the enduring responsibility of law enforcement to pursue the truth regardless of how much time has passed. That legacy carries lasting importance. Cold cases are often described by numbers. Years unsolved. Boxes of evidence. Pages of reports. Laboratory submissions. Yet behind every statistic stands a human life interrupted by violence. The Johnston investigation reminds investigators, journalists, and the public alike that solving a case is ultimately about restoring identity to the victim rather than merely identifying the offender. Charles O. Droke's name entered the historical record because the evidence led investigators there. Lella Johnston's name remained at the center of the investigation because she was the reason the investigation existed. That distinction defines the ethical foundation of homicide work. Every technological breakthrough, every genealogical chart, every laboratory analysis, and every hour spent reviewing decades-old files served a single purpose: honoring the commitment made in 1976 that her murder would never simply be forgotten. In the end, the case became more than the resolution of one homicide. It became evidence that truth can survive extraordinary lengths of time. It became proof that meticulous investigative work can outlast the careers of those who began it. And it became a lasting reminder that while justice sometimes arrives too late for a courtroom, it can still arrive in the form of certainty, a certainty earned not through speculation, but through evidence patiently preserved across nearly half a century. Nearly 5 decades separated the murder of Lella Johnston from the moment investigators publicly announced that they had identified the man responsible. During those 47 years, the United States changed in ways almost unimaginable to the detectives who first responded to the crime scene in May 1976. Police cars became mobile computers. Fingerprint files evolved into nationwide digital databases. Crime scene photography shifted from film to high-resolution digital imaging. Most dramatically, forensic science advanced from simple blood typing to sophisticated DNA sequencing capable of connecting distant relatives across generations. Yet despite every technological revolution, one principle remained constant. A homicide investigation begins and ends with evidence. The Johnston case became an enduring illustration of that principle because the evidence never changed. What changed was the scientific ability to understand it. The biological material collected inside Lella Johnston's home remained silent for decades, but silence did not mean absence. It simply meant investigators had not yet developed the tools necessary to hear what it contained. This distinction is essential to understanding why cold cases continue to be reopened throughout the country. Investigators do not reopen old files merely because time has passed. They reopen them because science has changed. Every significant advance in forensic technology invites a simple but profoundly important question. What if yesterday's evidence can answer today's questions? That philosophy has reshaped homicide investigations across the United States. Police departments increasingly maintain specialized cold case units whose responsibilities differ from those of detectives handling newly committed crimes. Rather than racing against immediate deadlines, cold case investigators examine historical evidence with patience, searching for opportunities created by technological progress. The investigation into Lella Johnston's murder reflected that careful, methodical approach. Every document generated during the original investigation retained value. Crime scene diagrams established the physical layout of the residence. Autopsy findings documented the injuries sustained by the victim. Evidence inventories confirmed what had been collected and preserved. Witness interviews captured observations that, while limited, formed part of the historical record. Modern investigators treated these materials not as relics, but as working documents. Nothing was assumed. Nothing was overlooked simply because earlier investigators had reached no definitive conclusion. Instead, every component of the original investigation was reconsidered alongside contemporary forensic findings. That process required extraordinary discipline. Cold case detectives often describe their work as an exercise in balancing respect for the past with openness to new possibilities. They recognize that original investigators acted within the scientific limitations of their time. Rather than criticizing earlier decisions, modern detectives seek to build upon them. The Johnston investigation exemplified that philosophy. The detectives of 1976 had not failed. They had preserved the opportunity for future success. As investigative genetic genealogy became more widely accepted within law enforcement, experts emphasized that the technique should be viewed as one investigative resource among many. Public attention often focused on the novelty of using family relationships to identify unknown individuals, but experienced investigators understood that genealogy alone cannot establish the complete circumstances of a homicide. Evidence must still be interpreted carefully. Historical records must still be verified. Investigative conclusions must still be supported independently. The Johnston case demonstrated this layered process. Genealogical analysis directed investigators toward Charles O. Droke. Additional investigative work confirmed that direction before any public announcement was made. This deliberate methodology protected the integrity of the investigation while ensuring that scientific findings were evaluated within the broader context of all available evidence. For forensic professionals, another lesson emerged from the case. Evidence preservation is not simply a technical requirement. It is an ethical responsibility. Every biological sample collected from a crime scene represents the possibility of future discovery. Investigators cannot predict which scientific techniques will exist 20, 30, or 50 years later. Their responsibility is therefore to preserve evidence in a condition that allows future generations to apply methods that have not yet been invented. The officers who worked inside Lela Johnston's home in 1976 fulfilled that responsibility. Their careful handling of the crime scene ultimately became as important as any later scientific breakthrough. Without preserved evidence, there would have been no DNA profile. Without the DNA profile, there would have been no genealogical investigation. Without genealogy, the identity of the offender might never have been established. Each stage depended entirely upon the professionalism demonstrated at the beginning of the investigation. The resolution of the Johnston case also encouraged broader discussions about victims whose cases remain unsolved today. Across the United States, thousands of families continue waiting for answers. Some investigations involve unidentified offenders. Others involve unidentified victims. Still others contain fragments of evidence that current technology cannot yet fully interpret. Cases like Johnston's provide cautious optimism rather than unrealistic certainty. They remind investigators that scientific progress often arrives gradually. What appears impossible today may become routine tomorrow. This perspective has influenced the way many agencies prioritize long-term evidence management. Biological evidence is now preserved under increasingly rigorous standards. Digital record systems reduce the risk of losing investigative documentation. Cold case reviews occur whenever significant forensic advances become available. These practices reflect lessons learned from investigations spanning multiple generations. The Johnston case stands among those lessons. For historians of forensic science, the investigation marks an important moment in the evolution of criminal justice. It demonstrates how advances in genetics have fundamentally altered the relationship between time and evidence. In previous decades, investigators often viewed the passage of time primarily as an obstacle. Witnesses forgot details. Memories faded. Physical evidence deteriorated. Suspects disappeared. Today, while those challenges remain, technological innovation has introduced a counterbalancing force. Time also allows science to advance. The same decades that separate investigators from a crime may also produce entirely new methods capable of interpreting preserved evidence. That reality transformed Lella Johnston's investigation. 47 years became both the greatest obstacle and, ultimately, the pathway to resolution. If the crime had occurred only a few years earlier, the necessary scientific methods would not yet have existed. If evidence had not been preserved throughout those decades, modern techniques would have had nothing to analyze. The convergence of diligent evidence preservation and advancing forensic science created an opportunity that investigators patiently pursued until the available facts supported a definitive conclusion. For the Oklahoma City Police Department, solving one of its oldest unresolved homicides represented more than a departmental achievement. It reaffirmed the enduring obligation of law enforcement to victims whose cases remain open regardless of age. Investigations may change hands. Technology may evolve. Communities may transform. Yet the responsibility to pursue the truth remains constant. Lella Johnston's murder no longer occupies the uncertain space reserved for unsolved crimes. Instead, it has become part of the broader history of forensic investigation, a case demonstrating how perseverance, scientific innovation, and careful preservation of evidence can converge across generations to answer questions that once seemed destined to remain forever unresolved. Even now, the legacy of the investigation continues beyond its own conclusion. Every time detectives reopen another decades-old homicide, every time forensic scientists examine preserved biological evidence with newly developed methods, and every time a family receives long-awaited answers because investigators refuse to abandon an aging file, the lessons of cases like Lella Johnston's quietly endure. They remind everyone involved in the pursuit of justice that while time may conceal the truth, it does not always defeat it. Sometimes, the truth simply waits for the world to become capable of finding it. By the time the investigation into Lella Johnston's murder officially reached its conclusion, nearly half a century had passed since detectives first crossed the threshold of her Oklahoma City home. The people assigned to the case had changed many times. Entire generations of police officers had come and gone. Advances in science had transformed nearly every aspect of criminal investigation. Yet the purpose of the case had remained remarkably consistent from beginning to end, to determine, as accurately and responsibly as possible, who had taken Lella Johnston's life. That consistency reflects one of the defining principles of homicide investigation. A murder case does not expire simply because years pass. Unlike many other criminal offenses, homicide investigations remain open until evidence establishes what happened or until every realistic investigative avenue has been exhausted. In Johnston's case, the availability of preserved biological evidence meant that new investigative opportunities continued to emerge as forensic science evolved. The official announcement identifying Charles O. Droke as the individual responsible was therefore not the beginning of the story's significance. It was the culmination of decades of patient investigative work carried out by people separated by time but connected by a shared commitment to the same victim. Among experienced investigators, the Johnston case is often discussed not only because it was solved through investigative genetic genealogy, but because it illustrates the importance of continuity. Continuity in evidence preservation. Continuity in documentation. Continuity in institutional commitment. Every detective who reopened the file inherited responsibility from someone else. Every laboratory scientist relied upon evidence collected decades earlier. Every conclusion depended upon the accuracy of work completed long before modern forensic technology existed. This chain of professional responsibility stretched across 47 years without interruption. That continuity is one of the least visible but most essential elements of successful cold case investigations. Public attention naturally focuses on the final breakthrough: the DNA, the genealogy, the identified suspect. Yet those developments become meaningful only because countless smaller decisions were made correctly throughout the life of the investigation. Evidence remained properly cataloged. Property records remained intact. Laboratory documentation remained accessible. Original reports remained preserved. Without those seemingly routine administrative responsibilities, the later scientific breakthroughs might never have been possible. The Johnston investigation, therefore, serves as a reminder that exceptional outcomes often depend upon ordinary professionalism sustained over long periods of time. It also demonstrates the evolving relationship between science and law enforcement. For much of the 20th century, homicide investigations relied heavily upon eyewitness testimony, physical surveillance, confessions, fingerprints, and traditional forensic methods. DNA profiling fundamentally altered that landscape, allowing investigators to establish biological connections with extraordinary precision. Investigative genetic genealogy expanded those capabilities even further. Instead of searching only for exact matches within criminal databases, investigators could now identify biological relatives whose publicly available genetic information provided investigative leads. Importantly, genealogy did not replace conventional detective work. Rather, it complemented it. The Johnston investigation followed exactly that model. Scientific analysis identified a possible direction. Historical research narrowed the possibilities. Detectives verified the available facts. Only after those stages aligned did the Oklahoma City Police Department publicly identify Charles O. Droke as the offender. That measured process reflected the department's commitment to evidentiary standards rather than speculation. Another lasting contribution of the Johnston case lies in its educational value. Police academies, forensic training programs, and homicide investigators increasingly study cold case resolutions to understand how investigative practices evolve across generations. Cases like Johnston's reinforce several enduring lessons. Protect every crime scene as though future technology will reveal more than current technology can. Preserve every piece of biological evidence, whenever practical. Maintain complete documentation. Review unsolved investigations periodically as forensic science advances. Never assume that the absence of immediate answers means answers will never exist. These principles have become central to modern cold case strategy. For families of homicide victims, however, the investigation carries a different significance. Scientific achievements are important. Institutional lessons are valuable. But beneath every investigative success remains a deeply personal story. Lela Johnston's family lived for decades without certainty. During those years, they experienced the unique burden associated with unsolved violent crime. Every anniversary revived unanswered questions. Every media report about newly solved cold cases created cautious hope. Every advance in forensic science raised the possibility that their own case might someday receive renewed attention. Eventually, it did. Although prosecution was impossible because Charles O. Droke had died in 1989, the identification itself carried profound meaning. The uncertainty that had defined the case for nearly half a century was replaced with an evidence-based conclusion. For many families, that distinction matters enormously. Grief rarely disappears, but uncertainty can. The Johnston investigation also reminds the public that successful cold case work depends upon collaboration extending far beyond a single police department. Forensic laboratories, genealogical researchers, evidence technicians, medical examiners, prosecutors, records specialists. Each discipline contributed expertise essential to the investigation. Modern homicide investigations increasingly reflect this multidisciplinary approach. No single individual solves a complex cold case alone. Instead, resolution emerges through cooperation among professionals possessing different skills but pursuing the same objective. That collaborative model represents one of the most important developments in contemporary criminal investigation. Looking back at the original crime in 1976, investigators could not have predicted how dramatically forensic science would evolve. Likewise, today's investigators cannot fully predict what technologies may exist 50 years from now. Artificial intelligence may improve evidence analysis. Advanced DNA sequencing may reveal currently undetectable information. New methods of trace evidence examination may emerge. Future investigators may possess capabilities that seem almost unimaginable today. The Johnston case encourages law enforcement to prepare for that future by preserving evidence with extraordinary care. Evidence collected today may answer questions that cannot yet be asked. That possibility fundamentally changes the way investigators approach every homicide scene. Ultimately, the story of Lela Johnston's murder extends beyond one victim and one offender. It represents a broader transformation in criminal justice. It demonstrates how persistence can outlast uncertainty, how scientific progress can reshape historical investigations, how careful documentation can preserve opportunities across generations, and how the pursuit of truth continues even when decades intervene between a crime and its resolution. For Oklahoma City, the case stands as one of the department's most significant cold case achievements. For forensic science, it represents another milestone demonstrating the practical value of investigative genetic genealogy. For detectives, it serves as a professional reminder that no carefully preserved piece of evidence should ever be considered without future potential. Most importantly for Lela Johnston, the case ensured that history would no longer remember her solely as the victim of an unsolved homicide. Instead, she is remembered as the woman whose case helped demonstrate that truth can endure extraordinary stretches of time, and that even after 47 years, diligent investigation and advancing science can work together to replace silence with evidence, uncertainty with fact, and one of Oklahoma City's oldest unanswered questions with a documented, carefully supported conclusion. For nearly half a century, the murder of Lela Johnston existed in two different worlds. In one world, it was a police file, a case number, a collection of photographs sealed inside evidence envelopes, laboratory reports filed away in storage, names typed onto aging interview forms. In the other world, it was deeply personal. It was an empty chair at family gatherings, a birthday remembered without celebration, a question that lingered through generations, a life interrupted without explanation. The remarkable aspect of the Johnston investigation is not simply that investigators eventually identified the offender. It is that the case demonstrates how those two worlds, professional investigation and personal loss, can remain connected across decades without either one surrendering to time. Every cold case forces investigators to confront an uncomfortable reality. Justice is measured differently once years become decades. In an active homicide investigation, success usually means an arrest, a prosecution, and ultimately, a verdict delivered in court. In a decades-old investigation, those possibilities often disappear.
Witnesses die. Suspects die.
Physical locations change. Memories fade. Documents are lost. Communities transform beyond recognition. Yet the obligation to establish the truth remains exactly the same. That obligation guided the Oklahoma City Police Department throughout the Johnston investigation. When detectives concluded, through preserved forensic evidence and investigative genetic genealogy, that Charles O. Droke was responsible for the rape and murder of Lela Johnston, they were careful about what they claimed. They did not speculate about conversations no one had heard. They did not invent motives unsupported by evidence. They did not reconstruct dramatic scenes that could not be verified. Instead, they relied upon the strongest foundation available in criminal investigation, documented evidence examined through modern scientific methods. That restraint deserves recognition. True crime has become increasingly popular around the world.
Books.
Television documentaries.
Podcasts.
Streaming series. YouTube channels. Millions of people consume stories about unsolved murders every year. Yet popularity sometimes creates pressure to transform investigations into entertainment. Mysteries become myths. Rumors become facts. Speculation becomes accepted history. The Johnston investigation reminds us why responsible storytelling matters. The facts themselves are powerful enough. A 78-year-old homicide file preserved for 47 years. Biological evidence surviving long enough to benefit from scientific techniques unimaginable in 1976. Generations of detectives refusing to abandon the investigation. A victim finally receiving an evidence-based answer after decades of uncertainty. There is no need to exaggerate such a story. Reality carries its own weight. The investigation also illustrates an important ethical principle in forensic science. Technology should strengthen truth, not replace it. Every advancement, from fingerprint analysis to DNA profiling to investigative genetic genealogy, has expanded the ability of investigators to answer difficult questions. But none of these tools remove the responsibility to verify conclusions carefully. Scientific evidence must always be interpreted within its proper context. Investigators understand this better than anyone. DNA can establish biological association. Historical records establish chronology. Witness statements provide context. Crime scene analysis reconstructs events. Together, these elements create an investigative narrative supported by evidence rather than assumption. The Johnston case followed that model from beginning to end. It is also worth considering how different the outcome might have been had the original investigators approached the crime scene differently. Suppose biological evidence had not been collected. Suppose packaging procedures had contaminated critical samples. Suppose documentation had been incomplete. Suppose evidence had been discarded years later because the case appeared unsolvable. Any one of those failures could have prevented future investigators from identifying the offender. Instead, the opposite occurred. Professional standards maintained in 1976 protected opportunities that would not become meaningful until nearly 5 decades later. That continuity is perhaps the investigation's greatest achievement. The detectives who first responded never received public recognition for solving the case. Many never lived to see its conclusion. Yet, without their work, the conclusion would never have existed. In that sense, the Johnston investigation belongs equally to every generation of professionals who contributed to it. The patrol officers who secured the residence. The crime scene technicians who documented the evidence. The forensic analysts who preserved biological material. The detectives who reviewed the file year after year. The laboratory scientists who developed modern DNA profiles. The genealogists who reconstructed family histories. The administrators who supported renewed investigation. Each became part of a single investigation extending across 47 years. Very few criminal investigations illustrate that level of institutional continuity. Another lesson emerges when considering the offender. Charles O. Droke died in 1989, decades before investigators identified him through modern forensic techniques. His death meant the criminal justice system could never conduct a trial. No testimony would be heard. No defense presented. No jury deliberation would occur. That reality often disappoints those expecting traditional courtroom justice. Yet, homicide investigators recognize another form of justice. Historical truth. Establishing what happened as accurately as possible. Identifying the person responsible based upon available evidence. Correcting the historical record. Providing surviving relatives with factual answers. These outcomes cannot replace prosecution. But neither should they be underestimated. For many families, certainty carries enormous emotional significance. An unanswered question can shape generations. A documented answer allows history to move from uncertainty toward fact. As forensic science continues evolving, cases like Johnston's will likely influence investigative priorities for years to come. Police agencies increasingly understand that preserving evidence is not merely about today's investigation. It is about tomorrow's possibilities. Every properly stored biological sample represents information that future technologies may unlock. Every carefully maintained case file preserves opportunities for detectives who have not yet entered the profession. This long-term perspective has fundamentally reshaped homicide investigation. It encourages patience, precision, documentation, and, above all, persistence. Looking back now, it is remarkable how little the evidence actually changed. The DNA did not suddenly appear. The crime scene did not reveal new physical clues. The documents remained exactly as investigators had left them decades earlier. What changed was humanity's ability to interpret information that had been present all along. Science advanced. Knowledge expanded. Technology matured. Eventually, those developments intersected with evidence preserved by investigators who believed their work mattered, even if they could not foresee exactly why. That belief proved correct. Lela Johnston's case stands today as more than the resolution of one homicide. It stands as a testament to professional discipline, scientific innovation, and the enduring commitment of investigators who refuse to accept that time alone should determine whether a victim receives answers. The silence lasted 47 years. The evidence never stopped waiting. And when science finally became capable of listening, it revealed the truth that had remained hidden since that spring day in Oklahoma City in 1976, a truth preserved not by chance, but by generations of investigators who understood that every victim deserves the possibility of being heard, no matter how many years have passed.